Hi everyone, today we're talking about introverted sensing. Moving on with the series that I started a couple of months ago with respect to the cognitive functions through the perspective of Carl Jung in psychological types. So the way that we have been doing this in the last few weeks has been looking at the way Carl Jung described the functions in psychological types. Basically me reading out some of the sentences and paragraphs from the book and interpreting them and connecting them to my own thoughts and ideas. Okay, so today we will do the same, and the focus will be on introverted sensing. So all about that in the next few minutes. If you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and let's dive in. So when it comes to introverted sensing, we will mainly look at this function as it is manifested in the types that have it as a dominant function, so ISTJ and ISFJ in our current understanding. I said this in one of my last videos, but I would like to highlight it again because there seems to be some sort of misunderstanding sometimes with the language. Carl Jung talked about intuition and sensing as being mental processes or cognitive functions that are irrational, whereas they are also perception functions. But this is not to be confused with the P that MBTI currently associates with types, right? So the last letter of the type. Similarly, thinking and feeling are judging or rational types, but again, this judging should not be misunderstood as being the J that is the last letter in some of the types, okay? Because in our case, introverted sensing is a perception function. However, it dominantly exists in ISTJ and ISFJ, at least not from a socionics perspective, but from an MBTI perspective, or the way that we currently mainly talk about the types. Okay, so I'm going to start by citing Carl Jung here. He said this: "It is an irrational type inasmuch as its selection among occurrences is not primarily rational, but is guided rather by what just happens. Whereas the extroverted sensation type is determined by the intensity of the objective influence, the introverted type is orientated by the intensity of the subjective sensation constituent released by the objective stimulus. Obviously, therefore, no sort of proportional relation exists between object and sensation, but something that is apparently quite irregular and arbitrary, judging from without. Therefore, it is practically impossible to foretell what will make an impression and what will not." So what Jung is saying here basically is that because it is an introverted process, it is subjective. In Jung's theory, all introverted functions are subjective and extroverted functions are objective, which is a bit different than what we sometimes talk about functions, basically. But his idea is that whenever this direction of attention is inwards, of course, there will be some sort of an entanglement between the individual and the perception that it kind of represents within the self, which gives this mental process a very subjective character. So for the types that have introverted sensing as a dominant function, ISTJs and ISFJs, you will notice how important it is for them to represent the sensory content in a way that is let's say very particular to them. Similarly to how introverted intuition represents experiences or perceptions internally by associating abstract images to them, introverted sensing will focus a lot on the bodily perception, but in a subjective way of the object. So whatever it is that is external to the self, okay? Now, Carl Jung also says, on the contrary, he may actually stand out by the very calmness and passivity of his demeanor or by his rational self-control. Normally, the object is not consciously depreciated in the least, but its stimulus is removed from it because it is immediately replaced by a subjective reaction which is no longer related to the reality of the object. And honestly, I think this is just brilliant, this description, because it shows that introverted sensing grasps the object, the stimulus. Okay, so whatever that might be, a light, some physical visual representation of something, or a sound, or whatever, and it does not focus on that exact object as extroverted sensing does, but it takes the sensation from it and integrates it within the self with the aim to separate it from what it originally started from. So in this way, these types find it easy to disconnect from the actual stimulus. And the way I imagine it is that introverted sensing types have this sort of, I don't know, thermometer, barometer, whatever measurement device you might want to imagine, which constantly goes up and down, trying to adjust the self to the subjective interpretation of the sensation. I don't know if that makes much sense, but it makes a lot of sense in my mind. This is why Jung points out the idea of being calm or passive in these types, because I think it's very much related to the idea that introverted sensing types, and here I also want to include ISFJs and ISTJs, because they all kind of send off this vibe of balance and stability. When I'm around them, and when other people are around them as well, they feel more at ease in a way, or they feel like this consistency that introverted sensing comes with kind of, brings them down, makes them feel calm themselves. And this idea of calmness and peace that this function exudes kind of inspires other people to be the same. Okay, moving on. Such a type can easily make one question why one should exist at all, or why objects in general should have any right to existence, since everything essential happens without the object. I think this is just saying that because introverted sensing does such a great job of detaching the inner experience from the actual stimulus, that the relevance, the psychological relevance that these people place on it is very different. So that's definitely something that I would take into account when trying to understand Jung's words, because it does sound a little bit extreme. Okay, and then the next thing that I found fascinating in psychological types, and when I read it the first time, I thought it was brilliant. It said, the too low is raised a little, the too high is made a little lower. The enthusiastic is damped, the extravagant restrained, and the unusual brought within the correct formula. All this in order to keep the influence of the object within the necessary bounds. It's amazing how Jung described this, because, we often associate introverted sensing right now with like tradition and rules and the tried and tested, and to the things that one is used to. And I think it's not so much about that as it is about this internal thermometer or barometer or whatever that is adjusting everything that comes from the outside to the inside for it to be kept under control, for it to not be too extreme. And I've heard this countless of times from SJ types telling me how important it is to calm it down, to tone it down, the positive and the negative. An ISFJ that is close to me once told me, I hate everything that is extreme. We should not go into the extreme. We should always aim to tone things down and to have a rational perspective over them. But I think she meant to kind of keep it under control so that the internal sensory world is not overwhelmed. And another idea that comes to mind here is that, well, if the internal world is kept under control, it means then the individual is not overwhelmed by the immense amount of subjective perceptions, subjective interpretations of the sensory world. And it serves the individual in the sense that it enables him or her to kind of ground themselves and not be completely, wiped away overwhelmed by what they are experiencing or understanding, because they bring so much value out of that sensory experience and they interpret so much about it that they need to kind of tone it down and have less experience in order to be able to fully immerse and feel this experience, if that makes sense. Whereas with extroverted sensing wants more experience because it focuses on what is, and likes knowing more and more about what is. Whereas introverted sensing does a bit of the opposite. Okay, moving on. Carl Jung also said, his unconscious is distinguished chiefly by the repression of intuition, which thereby acquires an extroverted and archaic character. It possesses therefore something dangerous, something actually undermining, which often stands in the most vivid contrast to the gentle benevolence of consciousness. So, as long as the individual is not too aloof from the object, the unconscious intuition effects a wholesome compensation to the rather fantastic and over-credulous attitude of consciousness. But as soon as the unconscious becomes antagonistic to the consciousness, such intuitions come to the surface and expand their nefarious influence. They force themselves compellingly upon the individual, releasing compulsive ideas about objects of the most perverse kind. Interesting again, Carl Jung is pointing out that whenever introverted sensing is a dominant process, that type also has extroverted intuition as an inferior process, which will be the sensitive point, the soft spot of the type that will kind of overwhelm the individual with the conclusions. It's a repressed function, but then of course the more you repress something, the more it comes out. So it will overwhelm the individual with the number of possibilities, the number of interpretations and meanings that it can bring. But it will not allow the person to kind of make use of this function in a way that is helpful, but rather problematic. And rather disturbing. And honestly, this is something I have seen in some ISFJ types when getting into some sort of an Enneagram or whatever you might call it, where contrary to how they normally were, contrary to how they normally behaved, they had a tendency to completely immerse themselves into too many things, not being able to focus anything, not being consistent with anything, getting carried away by possibilities in a way that you'd expect an any type to be, but most of the time it was in a destructive way. So yeah, I think that's quite interesting. Okay, so these are my thoughts and my interpretations on Carl Jung's description of introverted sensing. This is the second to last video of the series. Next week we will be talking about extroverted sensing, also through the perspective of Carl Jung. So thank you guys, thank you a lot for watching this video, for being with me. If you have anything else to add or ask, please feel free to do it in the comment section below. And as always, thanks a lot and see you next week.